Welcome to the SumerSports show with Thomas Dimitroff. I am Lindsay Rhodes. We have a lot to talk about today. Some breaking news this morning out of New York. After breaking news yesterday out of New York, the Jets have fired Joe Douglas after 5+ years as their general manager. The Giants have benched Daniel Jones. We're in a New York state of mind today on the SumerSports show, T.
Wow, what a lead in that is. That's very creative. I appreciate that. I don't even know where to begin because every time someone gets fired, whether it's a head coach or a general manager, it affects me at a lot of different levels, obviously because I experienced that, right? And when you're talking about Joe Douglas, I mean it's a big move. There's been a lot of talk about it over the last, few games or last few weeks or even longer going into this season. I want to be very clear about this from my perspective. Joe Douglas, and I've said this time and again, is a very good football man. He is in no way not know what he's doing. He's put together a lot of really good football players on that team. They have not been successful. I get that. In the end, this is a win and lose league, right? We get how that is. I get how it is. I got fired in the middle of the season, actually after the first quarter of the season. It's a really unnerving time. And yet there is an element, I will tell you, when you kind of feel it's coming, just a bit of relief because it gets to a spot where it keeps going round and round. I saw something recently, and I'm gonna stir you here, who mentioned that Joe Douglas was the worst GM ever in the history of the NFL statistically. I'm like, that's asinine. So not the case.
It's that makes me almost like angry because I feel like I'm missing something. And it's possible that I'm missing something. Obviously, this is not the space of like every little detail with regards to the Jets roster and, cap management and all that kind of stuff. That's not the world in which I live. Just like focused on that bubble, like New York talk radio shows maybe do. And Jets fans certainly are like a lot of their existence is kind of spent living in this space. That's not mine. So I understand, like you said, 30-64 is the record. No playoffs. It's from a win-loss record standpoint, I can understand needing just a hard reboot and like, let's go in a different direction. But to say something like he's the worst general manager in the history of a team with a long history of bad stuff, just kind of boggles the mind because I look at some of the draft picks. At the very least, you had a year not that long ago where you had the offensive rookie of the year and the defensive rookie of the year. This man has drafted Garrett Wilson. He drafted Breece Hall. He drafted Sauce Gardner. Will McDonald, Jermaine Johnson. Like there are guys that he has drafted that we know are good players and like high end players. And I think that that's part of the reason that this season has been so frustrating and so perplexing. They were 3-8. Woody Johnson himself said that this was the most talented team that he'd had. So if it's the most talented team, how does Joe Douglas not get any credit for that? That would feel like something's going wrong from the point of buying the groceries to making the food. Like he's giving you Kobe beef and you're grinding it up and making tacos. Like I don't understand exactly the disconnect there. How you can say that and then turn around and then also say, wow, that was bad. Now, I understand that there's also a lot more that goes into being a general manager, Thomas, in terms of leadership, in terms of communication, in terms of putting other right pieces in place to know how to make this meal, so to speak, just to continue the groceries analogy. And I don't know how he operates in those ways. So there might be some there. And like I said, at the very least, the record's not good. So I get it. We can move on and we can move in a different direction with new leadership. But I just don't know how you make some of those really extreme statements when he has provided the types of players. And I know it all goes back to the quarterback, but the quarterback position has also been wonky, right? Like the Zach Wilson was, that was a COVID year where you could argue maybe that he stuck with him too long, I suppose. Aaron Rodgers' tee is a move that a lot of teams that needed a quarterback would have made. And I didn't hear a lot of people saying, what a dumb move when he went out and got Aaron Rodgers. That just hasn't turned out to be the old Aaron Rodgers. I don't know. I'm a little bit perplexed.
No, I think when you look at someone like Joe Douglas, who is known in our league circles as being, again, very good at what he does, i.e., evaluating talent. That's his background. No one would deny that in our league. Everyone has a great deal of respect for Joe. And what you have alluded to, it has to do with so many more things than just the picking of the talent, right? A general manager ultimately needs to have a winning record. That's important. We know how that is. I think that Joe has gotten credit over the years for some very good picks. I really do believe that. I think the organization stayed beside him, strongly over the years when there are always challenges as a general manager. So it's not like after 2 years they just threw their hands up and thought, okay, we have to make a change. This is something that, of course, they've thought about. I mean, people can throw their darts any which way about decisions that have been made. The comment that I made to you a little bit earlier was not from anyone that really seemed like it was respected of. It was what's been knocking around in the community, in the writing world, or in the media world, or on the internet, suggesting otherwise, that it was historically one of the worst ever. That aside, what I'm saying right now with Joe and the organization is Joe's able to pull aside. There's reports out there that he's going to, in fact, eventually end up back with Baltimore, where he has a great relationship with Eric DaCosta and that organization. It's where he got his stripes, so to speak. They're obviously welcoming a guy back like that is really important. So that's one thing. Moving forward with the Jets, to your point, putting together the ostensibly the right team to take this to another level for them is going to be interesting to see what they do. There's a lot on their plate, right? There's a lot for them to do, a lot of work for them to do right now. And I had read out there somewhere where Phil Savage is in fact taking over as the interim GM. Is that what I read?
Yes. I wanted to ask you about that because that's an interesting, and I know that you are really good at, giving us a peek behind the curtain about like just dynamics, right? And Phil Savage is a guy who was brought in as a senior advisor primarily to Joe, right? I would assume, did Joe bring him in? Was he a Joe guy?
I'm pretty sure. And remember, there's all ties through the Cleveland Browns and the Baltimore Ravens. Phil was a GM at the Cleveland Browns at one time. Phil, another guy who has a really good reputation for evaluating. Those circles are strong, especially the ties between the Browns and the Ravens. So I'm sure that's what precipitated the hiring of Phil Savage.
So is that weird? Because the correlation that I make is kind of like if when the Falcons let you go, if they had turned to Scott Pioli, who was your guy.
Yeah, those are a little bit complicated, as long as, and there's some people that are going to point fingers at it and throw darts at the decision like, oh, that person must have circumnavigated, so to speak, or, went a roundabout to get that job. That's not the case. Normally what happens when there is a move like that, the owner and the president oftentimes will look at the scenario, who in the building can take over, who has experience in that position to take over. Remember, in Atlanta, when I got fired back in 2020, Rich McKay was still in the building, and Rich McKay had experience as a general manager. He didn't need to look around the rest of the building to see what other GMs I had in there that could step up. They do that with coaches, right? Who's the next ideal person? Do we have anyone that can bring us through the end of the season? Of course, they ostensibly felt that there was. And that is Phil Savage in this case, to bring him through, who can navigate because he's been there, done that before. So throw away the side of it's done in the wrong way and someone was doing something behind someone's back. That's not the case here at all. It's about getting a person that is in the building who can navigate moving forward with Jeff Ulbrich. And that's what I could imagine has happened in their decision.
So this feels like, and it has been framed by insiders as a move that they were expecting to happen. It was a matter of when, not if. And so actually, I want to go back to the point of waiting for the shoe to drop because, the environment in which you're working, I think you described something there that I was just actually having a conversation earlier today with regards to Doug Peterson in the same way. Like if the reports are already out that they're moving on, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. And then the team isn't doing anything well, like to go to work and be like, okay, I'm going to come up with a game plan, but I kind of think I'm going to get called into the owner's office later today. There are reports out that he's already made this decision. Like, how do you even go about your job? Like, it almost feels like the humane thing to do is to rip that Band-Aid off at that point. I'm talking about Jacksonville. We don't need to get into that conversation specifically, but it's funny that you mentioned that in some ways it can almost feel like a relief, because I would imagine it's very hard to do your job when all of this stuff starts swirling, and it does feel like an inevitability.
Oh, make no mistake about it. I mean, I don't even want to tiptoe around that. Yes, there are elements of relief there. Everyone who's in those positions, whether it's quarterbacks or general managers, generally speaking, are such competitors. They're driven to do the best they can do. And they get to that spot where things look hopeless and they're thinking there is so much negativity in any, I'm not even talking about in any specific organization. When you're losing and there's a narrative over the last year or two, or even beyond that, that is an enervating element, right? You are in there every day trying to put your best foot forward. And it doesn't matter whether you read the media or not, or you're on the internet, your kids are on the internet. You know, your wife is on the internet, or your partner is on the internet, whatever that may be, it's circulating within that building. People are walking around the building wondering, where am I in all this? Mm-hmm. They're thinking about the GM and the head coach, yes, but they're also attached to the GM and the head coach, Lindsay. So there is no doubt in any of these organizations, and in the Jets situation, what next? Am I going to survive? Are the people in the building at the middle management or at the rank and file, are they going to survive, or is there going to be a massive overhaul? That's a complicated place to be in. So you have to step up. You have to look straight and strong and be the right leaders that you are in those situations. And, lead up, lead aside, lead wherever you're leading. You have to do your right part. You hope to eliminate as much water cooler talk as possible. And I'm sure in the Jets situation, they would love to have that. It's not easy to do, Lindsay, right? People are just wondering. That's human nature. Mm-hmm. What does it mean for me? What does it mean for my department? And we could talk ad nauseum about that, of course.
Well, and just to bring it back to the thing that I'm picturing, like I think more in terms of, because I can picture how the pieces look when it comes to coaches, right? Than general managers and people behind the scenes. But in terms of like the Jacksonville situation, all this talk about Doug Peterson, that's every position coach that falls under his purview, right? So if he were fired, they might not all be let go immediately, but they know that they're probably going to be looking for jobs in the off season. And so now you're trying to get a football team ready and go through, your weekly preparation. And this is all hanging there. I think that those are really interesting points that you bring up.
Can I just mention that? So that's on the coaching side, right?
Yeah.
On the GM side, when a GM gets fired, of course, he's got a bevy of people below him, if that's even the right word. I don't even know if you use the word bevy in that situation. However, there are a lot of people below that general manager in different departments, of course. On the scouting side specifically, personnel directors or AGMs, personnel directors, scouts, national scouts, regional scouts, normally they are tied to the general manager. It's not as precarious for the scouting staffs, however, meaning if a new GM comes in, a lot of times a new GM will come in and they'll want a system in place. They'll oftentimes keep a lot of the people in those roles for a year to see how they play out in the new system. No one really wants to come in there, just so everyone knows. Rarely will a GM come in and start firing people on the scouting staff leading into free agency and the draft. Far from that. They're going to get through that wave until the other side of the draft and free agency and decide who has stood up well and who has not shown well during this transition period of 5 or 6 or 7 months. That's normally how it goes. Rarely does someone come in slashing and burning. Rarely. Yeah. It can happen, of course.
Well, you're in the middle. You're in the middle of a process there, right, from a scouting standpoint, right? Like they're mid-season, collecting information about all of the college kids. If you fired everybody, you'd be kind of back to zero, right? Like, so that would put the general manager behind the 8 ball. Yeah, those are very, very good points that you bring up there. On a personal note, we were talking a little bit before we started the live stream here. I am curious about, just because this touches on and I don't know how many people, care, but just these are human beings and you've gone through this before. What is this day like? What do you think that he's going through right now?
You and I have had some discussions about this. It's such a up and down emotional time, right? And rarely are you just like caught off of guard because you've been thinking about it. When you get to that spot and there's a wave, of, again, months, potentially even years plus of thinking about the precariousness of this position. So, but it's still the reality when you wake up in the morning or when you get that final notice that you are no longer going to be at the helm of an organization. It's impactful because a lot of times the people that are in these jobs, it's been their dream for 30 years to land that position or 20 or whatever it may be, and you no longer have it. And there's a good chance that when you get fired, and if you do get fired prematurely, that you might not ever land up in that spot again. So it's a chapter in your life. It's an emotional time. A good friend of mine and good friend of yours, I believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but Jay Glazer once said to me, you watch your MFing funeral in the morning on NFL Network and all the networks talking about, you getting fired. And that's in fact what it is. You sit back on the sofa and you have your coffee in the morning and you're blown away that they're talking about you just because you've seen it years and years. And it's always been someone else. It's been either your peers or it's been someone else. It's not been you. When you go through that, you start thinking about not only how people are portraying you, but you're also thinking about, and we also talked about this, and you and I have experienced this at different levels. When something changes drastically in your world, who reaches out? It's natural. You don't want to be persnickety about it and be moody. And
I'm all the petty.
But the reality is, well, I can't believe that person didn't reach out to me and even say, hey man, sorry to hear about it. Or, hey, Lynn, sorry that things are changing. Yep. Those are emotional times in a person's life. I don't want to proselytize about this, but I think everyone sometimes looks at it with head coaches and GMs. These guys are making millions and millions of dollars. I don't have any sympathy for them at all. They have kids, they have families, they have put their heart and soul into this. So it is complicated. And the empathic side that we all should have for anyone, whether they're making $5 or $6 million a year or, $15,000 a year, it's still a human that you're dealing with here. And again, Joe Douglas is a fantastic person and everyone in the league knows that. And I'm sure everyone right now is pulling for him in his transition.
Well, it's I told you before we started, I remember everybody who didn't reach out. When it became public knowledge that I was not going to be brought back at NFL Network, obviously there's a flood of text messages from people. And even if you can understand the decision, that's an intellectual side. You still want to hear that some people who were like in the trenches with you kind of like still see you and what you brought to the table. Those people in particular, it's not so much the people on the outside, like Jets fans should be like, thank you, Joe Douglas. Like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking like a very like inside situation here. And I 100% remember the people that like I thought were my people that I never heard from again. And so, that's just human nature.
It's human nature. And I think the last thing I'll say with regard to the Jets and a decision that they had to make, they made a decision that, some people want to know more about it with regard to a head coaching decision, right? A couple months later or whatever, they're making a decision on a general manager and Joe Douglas. These are hard decisions to make for the organization. And this is the fact, right? It's not like, hey, let's just move on from this. These are hard decisions for, Woody Johnson, of course, as the owner and presidentially for them to make here. They have to think about the here and now. They have to think about the future. There is a lot going on here. And this is not just going to be the Jets, as you know, this year. This may be affecting 4 or 5 other teams. Again, not that we need to go down that road right now. Every year there is turnover and teams are in the middle of not only the turnover, Lindsay, but also how are we going to right this ship and how are we going to take this back to where we need to be and historically bring it to a spot where people are 100% respecting our organization, that we are perceived as the organization that not only coaches want to come to, GMs want to come to, but also, and most importantly, players want to play for.
Yeah.
Because if you're not attracting the players to your organization, obviously that's challenging.
I mean, in a lot of ways, and I already mentioned that, the one thing that you can definitely say is that we never hit on a quarterback there while he was there. He did some good things in the draft. Drafts are hit and miss, right? So the fact I'm sure that people that are deep in the weeds of all the draft picks are like, yeah, but that guy didn't hit and this guy and that happens. But that happens in most places. The fact that I was able to rattle off like the hits that hit at such a high level that we are perplexed about what's going on there. I mean, the defense has been pretty good, right? And then they fired Robert Saleh, and there are a bunch of stats about how they've fallen way off since Robert Saleh was let go. And I'm not saying that was a bad decision, but I am saying that maybe at least on the defensive side of the ball, that was a problematic loss because these assets aren't even necessarily being used in the way that's not even a strength anymore on this team. I mean, that's become clear in the last few weeks. On the offensive side of the ball, you've got Garrett Wilson, you've got Breece Hall. Like you have enough pieces there. I mean, he went out and he got Devontae Adams because he wanted to give Aaron Rodgers every possible resource to succeed. I mean, you look at that team in a lot of ways, just focusing on the offense, there's a lot to work with there. And so it kind of comes back to the fact that from a numbers standpoint, the quarterback's not playing particularly well.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're cleaning house here and the coach has to go because that's what happens when you don't win games. And now the general manager is gone because that's what happens when you don't go to the playoffs and you lose a lot more games than you win. Then do we also have to look at the quarterback here? Is this a full-fledged cleaning house and Aaron Rodgers is not back because we just have to wipe our hands clean of this situation? Because to me, it feels like in a lot of ways, and this is unpopular to say, I think he's a bigger problem this year than Robert Saleh or Joe Douglas were. And so I kind of think you have to follow through on that all the way.
Well, look, that is a great question. I mean, the reality is whoever, the Johnsons hire, Woody Johnson and Chris Johnson, if in fact that's the case, however they approach this, they know that they are going to have that conversation prior to hiring someone on what their thoughts are. As an owner, the owner ultimately is going to make that decision on the decision on Aaron Rodgers and his future, meaning he is going to either make it or he's going to say to the new potential person, you make the decision. But ultimately, it's such a big organizational move that there is a lot of discussion that way. And I do want to come back to this. This isn't just a sort of like off the cuff decision to move on from Joe right now, I'm sure, right? They made the move with Robert Saleh, and here it is, Joe Douglas right now. I think some people are going to ask, okay, what's the significance of this time during the season, right? Again, when I got fired from the Atlanta Falcons back in 2020, Lindsay, it happened after the first quarter of the season. Uh-huh. It was kind of a clean, and that's Arthur Blank's desk is incredibly clean, literally and figuratively speaking, right? So I'm sure that felt right for the organization at that time. Why now? Maybe it's just right. You could argue as well. There's a humane side to that as well for Joe. Like, hey, if this is inevitable, what is the best next move for the organization in the planning going forward, right? There's a lot of planning that has to happen here. And so all of this said, circle this back to Aaron Rodgers and decisions. These are not easy decisions. These are really deep, thoughtful decisions from an organization that has a lot of experience in 2000, right? Woody Johnson bought the team in 2000. Like, it's not like this group is just learning to do what they're doing, right? They have been around it a long time, and they have some big decisions to make and a lot of thought out work to be digging into. And one is the Aaron Rodgers move. What will they do and how will he want to play? I think he said he wanted to play. Is that correct? I want to finish that conversation on Aaron. Has he publicly said he wants to continue to play or not?
I actually am not 100% sure where he stands on this, but I know where I stand on how much I care about where he stands. No. I mean, like at a certain point, I just think that it's not necessarily your call. Like I think that part of the problem in New York is that there's been so much kowtowing to that, you know, and I think that Joe Douglas went out of his way to do everything that Aaron Rodgers wanted him to do. He brought in Allen Lazard. He traded for Devontae Adams. None of that worked. And so has he now, to a degree, paid the price for having made those moves and then they didn't work? Like, someone else has to pay for that too. I will be interested to hear from, according to Connor Hughes, and Rodgers has said that he does want to play in 2025.
Well,
if I'm
again,
the New York Jets, I'm wiping the slate clean and I'm letting him go to the Vikings, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that's the Brett Favre thing. And there's a chance that Rodgers still plays well. But if I'm the Jets, I think that we have to go in a different direction. I will be interested to hear from Sean Syed in a little bit. He's going to join us in just a little bit to talk about some quarterbacks. He, crunches the tape, and I will be interested to hear his thoughts on Aaron Rodgers and how well or not well he thinks that he has actually played on the field. Because I'll tell you this, the advanced stats are not good. They're not good for Aaron Rodgers. But those don't always tell the whole story. And so in a little bit, we still want to talk about Daniel Jones and that benching there. And then when we get to talking about some of the different quarterback storylines that we want to talk about, I'll be sure to ask Sean Syed about Aaron Rodgers. First, though, to the Daniel Jones story and the fact that he has been benched in New York. And we talked about this last week. You said you thought it was obvious. It's going to happen. It was the bye week last week. Makes sense that they ripped the Band-Aid off. And in this move, they have actually turned to Tommy DeVito rather than Drew Lock. They're just skipping right over the backup quarterback and going to the number 3, Tommy DeVito, who did not experience a ton of success last year in terms of his specific play. He was 79th in EPA per dropback. There are obviously a lot of people that didn't play a ton of starting quarterback mixed in those numbers there. I mean, that could be like a wide receiver who took a drop back and threw it, and they're kind of mixed up in that. And I wasn't able to parse them out, but he had a negative 0.29 EPA per drop back last season. Daniel Jones this season, in terms of numbers, Thomas, ranks 26th in wins against replacement for passers, just ahead of Malik Willis, behind Tua, who missed time. And so that number is a little bit down, and Russell Wilson. He's ahead of Wilson, by the way. 29th in EPA per drop back. He's tied with Caleb. The quarterbacks who were worse than him in that particular category are Andy Dalton, Jacoby Brissett, Will Levis, Deshaun Watson, and Bryce Young. He's 25th in completion percentage over expectation, 29th in completion percentage. He was an 8-7 touchdown to interception ratio, has attempted the 10th most passes in the league, and has the 19th most passing yards. And I say all of those stats because I went back and forth with somebody whose opinion I respect very much, who said that they thought that Daniel Jones hadn't actually played that poorly and that this was mostly tied to the injury clause, which guarantees that he was going to be, worth $23 million that they were going to have to pay him if he couldn't pass a physical by March. And so this kind of falls into the Derek Carr, like, we've made our decision, we're moving on. We don't want to be on the hook for any kind of money. And so we're going to take you off the field. I think it's both. And I think that those numbers tell a story of a quarterback who is not playing well and not playing well several years into his tenure there. So the sample size is large enough. We know what we're dealing with. You got to rip the Band-Aid off. And they've made it clear that this is the direction that they're going to go in, a different one next year with this.
So, move. I mean, yeah, look, all those stats, I'm obviously in the data that we keep continuing to draw here at Sumer is fascinating as I watch it. And, last year, as I started thinking about what they needed to do and how they needed to approach it, and it's rare, it's hard to get a quarterback, right? There are a lot of mistakes at the quarterback position. We know that, as there are at some of the defensive end and pass rusher positions. It's a whole nother conversation. Quarterback situation, you start thinking about who's your supporting cast, who's around. I mean, they're 30, they've given up 30 sacks. I believe it was 30 sacks or 25th in sacks allowed. I mean, that's, so you start thinking about what is the supporting cast here right now. And, yes, he's struggling. Look, you can't take it away from this guy. He's a tough ass. He will run and compete his butt off. No question about that, right? He'll do whatever he needs to do. And he's taken a lot of heat. What happens to him? it's going to be interesting to see, of course, right, Lindsay? But when you're sitting there again as a team builder, believe me, this obviously is not a hard, difficult decision, but it is sort of difficult because you've put yourself on the line as head coach and general manager to say, this is the dude we want to go with. Now, we don't know internally how that went down, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Just like, and not to bring back the Jets, we don't know all the other discussions that led to Woody Johnson and company's decision to make both of those firings. There's a lot inside that building that we have no clue about, right? So in this situation, even though the fan base is, throwing out the darts and et cetera, what can they do here? And is this the right quarterback move? I'll ask you. And maybe we're going to be asking Sean Syed about that from his perspective. It needs to be done.
Oh, I think that it's an obvious move that needed to be made at the very least, which is not to say that Daniel Jones won't go somewhere next year and, sign up as a backup, a highly paid backup, and get an opportunity like Joe Flacco did, for a minute. Like, we've seen some people be thrown onto the field. Andy Dalton had short-term success there in Carolina before they decided to go back to Bryce Young. Like, I'm not saying that this is the last that we will have seen from Daniel Jones, but I think it's an obvious pivot point to put a bow on his career as a starter with New York. And I think he's the perfect example, Thomas, too, about, and I say this all the time, having an average quarterback is just the toughest position for these teams to be in. And you weren't necessarily in that situation. You had Kirk Cousins. I mean, you had Kirk Cousins. You did not have Kirk Cousins. The Falcons do now. You had Matt Ryan. So you had an above average quarterback, two very, very, very good quarterback the entire time that you were there. I think that the toughest position you could put on a general manager in is for a quarterback to be like Daniel Jones, where you go, well, it's average. Like, he's clearly not one of the best quarterbacks in the league, but there was this and the bad O-line. And did we see him in the best environment? And man, it could be a lot worse. There's like half of the league that's dealing with a worse quarterback situation. And then you extend him. And going back to your other point about ownership, I guarantee you that they didn't make this decision without the ownership's okay. Right. So, like, I don't know. It's
no question. And, we're also looking at a run game that is quite middling right now, which that's complicated too. If you're not rocking and rolling, and we don't even need to bring up the Barkley situation, but I'm sure it will forever plague this.
Do you think that's valid though, Thomas? Because everyone is going to bring up the Saquon Barkley. So maybe it's worth bringing up. I will go to my grave probably. If that's soon, then I definitely will. Look at you. I will argue till I'm blue in the face that was still the right move for the Giants, because I really strongly believe that what we're seeing from Saquon Barkley, I think they did us a favor to a degree, like us as the larger NFL community, in letting him go to a team where we could see what he could do, because we wouldn't be seeing this. Saquon Barkley would not be doing what he's doing with the Eagles if he was still on this Giants team. He just wouldn't. We've seen that for the last few years. We were on the outside looking at his advanced numbers, which are impacted by offensive environment, and saying, I don't know, does he still have it? Like, is it all there? Is it like, you just don't see running backs have success when they're in bad offenses, and it would have remained a bad offense with him in it. He would have had just a couple of plays where he gets to do that. But what we've seen in Philadelphia is not what we would have seen, in my opinion, if he were in New York. It wouldn't be like all of a sudden like, oh my God, Saquon looks like the old Saquon again. That's not how football works with running backs. And so I don't think it was a bad decision to let him go. Now, maybe you could argue you let him go to Philadelphia, you strengthened inside the division. At the very least, we hold on to him and you don't give him to somebody else who can hurt us more. But I don't know. Where do you stand on that move?
It's the 3.9 yards per carry that Barkley had last year with the Giants, that's significant to your point, right? All I'm saying is, I guess Saquon aside for a minute, you need a formidable running game for a quarterback when they are either young or they are more average or above average, whatever they perceived him being, right? You need a stout run game. I know that goes contrary to what we're all talking about. You can get a running back anywhere. You can get some good running backs in the 4th, 5th, and 6th rounds, and they can thrive. I think you need the right plan with them. You need to make sure that they're taking the pressure off these quarterbacks that are struggling, whether they're young and inexperienced or whether they're not so young and inexperienced, but they're not as good as you expected them to be, because it just takes the pressure off. It's the same with making sure that you have, in my opinion, you take two tight ends there and you develop a great offense with 2 high percentage shot tight ends. I mean, you can give Bill Belichick his due on that. There's no question that I'm a huge fan of that position operating well. Okay, let's go. Let's talk. I don't know if we can talk about it. Stavsky can pull up. What are the tight end statistics at the New York Giants right now? Where are we and what were the expectations?
Yeah, I mean, they don't have, I mean, well, the Giants tried. They tried at the very least there with Waller last year, right? And then it just didn't work out from an injury standpoint. I don't know that. I mean, I know Theo Johnson has been a guy that they've, kind of has gotten a little bit more run in the last couple of weeks. Back to the running back, though, I just want to say this: Tyrone Tracy, 9th in the NFL in yards per carry, 5.1 a pop. So you managed to get somebody who is actually averaging more yards per carry than Saquon did in the offense last year.
Yeah.
Who is in that backfield, and you got him cheaply in the draft. And so from a roster building standpoint, you are still getting production out of the backfield.
Okay. Here's a really interesting point, and I don't want to go hindsight on this. You think about Brock Bowers out on the left coast near where you are, a little bit different spot of the state there. I get it, but Brock Bowers is kicking butt for an organization right now that is obviously in a struggling situation.
Yeah.
But back to the draft. Do you draft a tight end who is one of the world's best in a long time? I'm being exaggerative there, but he is one of the best that's come out in a long time.
Who are we talking about? The Giants?
Neighbors. I'm talking about the Giants. Okay. If Giants were looking at it and they're like, okay, we don't have the quarterback necessarily. We're trying to figure out our quarterback situation. Do you get a high percentage shot tight end as good as he was? Or, and I love Malik Neighbors. I love what Joe Shane did that way. I thought, it's a great pick. But when you step back and you look at a quarterback that may be struggling, you don't know what to expect, or a young one, I just like the idea of having a stout, very athletic, and very accomplished tight end, accomplished as far as his abilities.
Absolutely. No, that's a really interesting point. I can't help but factor positional value into this, because the tight end at the end of this is, you're not benefiting from the fact that you took him as much there financially. Whereas like Malik Neighbors looks like a high end one, like you hit that pick. And to your point, it might not be helping you develop your offense and win games, which is ultimately the point. But if you do have a quarterback, then Malik Neighbors is obviously the right call, because now you have him at, 5 years. And but I think you bring up a really interesting point. If from a roster development standpoint, what you're actually looking at, and you need Daniel Jones to succeed, maybe that would have been a better move from them. Or you could argue that not giving him that rips the Band-Aid off faster. Like, you have to be able to operate in this environment if we're going to continue down this road with you. And so maybe this just puts you in that spot, and we gave you Malik Neighbors. If you can't get it done, then we're moving on. And it's a good thing we know that now.
Yeah. But I mean, we look at Theo Johnson, he's 58th in the league, 58th percentile, I think, in the league, right? I think that's what it is as far as where we're producing as a tight end. Only thing I'm saying to you is my own experience with Matt Ryan and Tony Gonzalez. Tony Gonzalez, even though Julio Jones and Roddy White, we had a number of people around Matt. Tony Gonzalez was the most important acquisition that we made to help Matt Ryan evolve into being what he was. And I would argue much better than above average, but that's your semantic.
No, I don't want to. Yes, no. You're right. That was an unfair characterization.
Okay. I would more say, the people that want to argue good to very good, because I think he was a very good quarterback. My point on it all is what I'm saying. Tony was very important for us in that setting. And I just think it's important to realize that making sure that you have the right supporting cast for a quarterback that you're either growing with or you're really not sure about. We can go on and on. I don't want to beat the point to death.
I would like to bring in Sean Syed now, the host of the Stats and Scheme podcast. You are one of our in-house guys that I could go to with any kind of scheme question. I know that you are grinding the tape. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this last conversation that we've had and whether or not Saquon Barkley would have succeeded in this Giants offense. And to Thomas's point, which I think is a good one, would a strong tight end have changed things for this offense, in your opinion, too, based on what you've seen?
When I look at the Giants, and obviously their last game is that game in Germany against the Panthers, there's just too many examples of Daniel Jones, missing open guys, or when you make that throw, it's just not accurate enough. And you think about the situation where Malik Neighbors is an awesome player. I think he's going to be an awesome player in this league for a long time. It just felt like Jones was holding up the entire operation. And at the running back spot, I really like Tyrone Tracy. I think that's a good example of, if you're a team that can afford to, make a move at a non-premium position like the Eagles did, that's a good thing. Like, that is something that I think you can argue yourself into. It was tough, I think, for the Giants to justify, considering how many holes they had on their roster. I think Saquon's having an awesome year in Philadelphia, particularly because of what Kellen Moore is doing from a run scheme perspective. Obviously, that offensive line is really good. And it's just unfortunate that that kind of coincides with just how bumpy the ride has been for the Giants, where, it's not like, hey, you replace Jones and you get this better play, but Jones certainly didn't play good enough, I think, to maintain that job. Of course, as you guys mentioned, there's that injury guarantee and there's all sorts of things kind of there. And it just feels like at this point, when you look at Daniel Jones, you're kind of hoping maybe he gets, a Geno or a Baker or a Darnold kind of renaissance later on in his career.
Working our way backwards here. How about Aaron Rodgers? We talked about the Joe Douglas firing. I contend that Aaron Rodgers is not playing well. The advanced numbers are not good. Is there something I'm missing that he is doing well where it is unfair to point the finger at him?
I think when you look at just what areas of the field he's targeting, they can't stress every blade of grass the way that some other teams are. I think that Rodgers, unfortunately, after that injury, is limited in terms of mobility, and that is just a problem where it feels like we can think back to maybe early in the season examples where he is moving around a little bit against the Patriots. But when you have an offense that is sort of built on, I'm going to catch the ball, I'm going to throw it to a spot, and hopefully I'm connecting with my receiver. If you're not on the same page over and over and over again, you have a volatility there that is really just unfortunate. So it's not like Rodgers is playing like a top 5 quarterback in the league, and it's not like they expected that from him this season. I think that you get some of the drop off from the defense, you get things not clicking on offense, and just have a situation that unfortunately, ends up as a pretty negative one.
And can I ask, Sean?
Yeah.
So all of that said about Aaron Rodgers, I'm going to put you on the spot here like I do Lindsay too often. First of all, I'm going to ask you, if you ranked him of the 32 quarterbacks ostensibly in the league, where do you rank Aaron Rodgers right now? Data aside, maybe it is not data aside for you ever, but where is he ranked? Give me a number.
Hey,
got to give me a number.
Thomas, I'm always going to look at the data as well. I'm never going to be one to say that we shouldn't look at it all. I definitely don't have him in the top 15. I think, you think about him maybe like in that 20 range, maybe even a little bit further down, because you have players that are playing so well. I think when we look at some of the rookie quarterbacks that played well this week, I think, you ask him on the spot, maybe you put him at like 18 and kind of hold your breath with where he's at. Okay,
so then you put your GM hat over that really cool hair of yours right now for a second, and you think about the acquisitions that the Jets had made, i.e. receivers, right? The people that came to the Jets for Aaron Rodgers. And you look at all that. I'm just very curious from a data standpoint, is there anything you could say like, wow, that's a tough decision to make? You have a lot on your hands if you're the GM sitting in that role and you're trying to make a decision on Aaron Rodgers. What are you doing with the other really, stellar enough players there, i.e. Davante Adams, whoever it may be? How do you approach that in your mind, just from a bigger picture standpoint?
You look at it and feel like pretty positive about the other positions, right? Davante Adams is not the Davante Adams of old, and that's okay. But Garrett Wilson is a really, really good player. And, he may not be performing all the way up to his expectation. I think that you look at it and it's not saying that Rodgers is this solution. Unfortunately, it feels like you're not winning because of Rodgers. If you are winning, you're maybe not fully winning in spite of him, but it's tough when you look at how many chips were put in the table at that specific decision. It feels like maybe it was a decision that they just had to make. I think that you're really wanting to get a lot more from Rodgers when you push so much in for him.
Good response. Thank you.
I have one more follow-up about Aaron Rodgers because his passing chart this past week was a lot of short and intermediate. I think he had, it looks like, I'm looking at the dots, it looks like 3 pass attempts past 10 yards. And 2 of them were incompletions. This week, in terms of his average completed air yards, it was 2.8. That was the second lowest in week 11. His average intended air yards was 4.2, which was the 4th lowest. His longest completed air yards pass was 27.7. That was the 2nd lowest. I'm sorry, that was before Monday Night Football. So it's possible that Cooper Rush entered the chat. But my point is that our conversation about Aaron Rodgers historically, even very recently, has been, yeah, but that arm. What do those numbers tell us? Is that maybe not the strength that we think it is anymore?
It's certainly unfair to hold him to the standard of, an MVP season or a few seasons ago. So I think that going into the season, some of the optimism around just the Jets offense, it's a little bit just about the unknown. I think for quarterbacks in general, like we look at the Cowboys game, you hear people immediately calling for Trey Lance. Everyone wants to look at who the next quarterback, we haven't seen them play a ton or something like that to try and get just a positive. And even looking at the Giants, like are you going to get excited about DeVito and Drew Lock? I think when you have someone that you haven't been able to just see play over and over, you get excited about that. I think that Rodgers was in such an exciting situation. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot that, he's not going to be throwing the ball down the field in that same sort of way. That can be a little bit structural, just how that they want to, or Rodgers really wants to have his passing game set up. And I just think it's tough. Like you can't stress the defense in the ways that I think you need to win in the modern NFL. And it's not like the Colts defense pressured him at like a league leading rate in this past week. I think that it's just things piling on to each other that makes you think about, I don't know, like what do the Jets end up doing next year to try and turn things around going forward?
In a stats and scheme, from a stats and scheme perspective, Sean, how much of this Aaron Rodgers situation can be put on the coordinator inconsistency, the change of the coordinator, Aaron's relationship with the previous coordinator to where it is now? In your mind, do you see any relevance in that discussion?
I absolutely do, because when you look at just what the product was on the field in terms of the plays that were called, in terms of the route spacing early in the season, it was not good enough. And then when you look at the change, like you can see some positive things. I just think that when you have a top end quarterback, he is your offense. Your offense is built around Rodgers. It is the Aaron Rodgers offense. And I think that if he was comfortable doing different things, I think that you hope you can get a voice in there to change things up. I think we look at Green Bay and what Matt LaFleur tried to do with Rodgers. They bounce back a little bit. And then just how he uses Jordan Love overall. Like Rodgers is going to have the final say, it feels like, based on what we're watching on the film. So I think that, something has to kind of go at his doorstep in terms of blame.
I'm going to do this. Let's go through some lists because you want to rank them, Thomas. Let's help you do it. Would you rather, at this point in time, have Aaron Rodgers or Tua?
I'm sorry, Aaron Rodgers or Tua?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. Are you really going to put me on the spot with the Jets? Why don't we move? Why don't we put Sean on?
How about Sean? How about Sean?
Well, when I'm thinking about Tua just as a player, like he is so offense specific, and it feels like at this point, I think I would rather take Tua, just because obviously Tua has, a bigger contract, but Rodgers where he is at, it's hard for me to think of really Rodgers leading a hyper successful offense, where with Tua, at least it does have to be very specific. I think it is in that particular Miami offense, but at least Tua, he's getting the ball out on time. He's getting it to the spots that he needs to be. Miami, of course, wins their last game. They're on 2-game win streak. Maybe they can kind of push a little bit closer kind of to that playoff picture.
You're amazing that you even took that as seriously as you did to answer the question with that much of like behind it. Like, I think it's obvious. Like, I would much rather have Tua at this point in time, which I realized 2 years ago, like that feels like, what are we talking about? But right now, I think 100%. I mean, Baker, Aaron, I think it's Baker.
I feel comfortable taking Baker there. I'm thinking about
Can you imagine? I'm sorry to interrupt. This is a great conversation. And it's a conversation that you would have within that building, I'm sure, if you're the Jets. Like, where are we? Categorically, all three of us, and I'm sure most everyone in the world believes that Aaron Rodgers at his heyday was one of the best quarterbacks to play in this game. I'm a huge fan of what he was. Right. Yeah, there was. no one was projecting an Achilles, and then coming back this year, wherever we are, to your point, every one of those guys have their shortcomings, right? Not because they're not good. Baker Mayfield, Tua, you don't know if tomorrow he hits his head and all of a sudden you're in a complete, that's not even what you're asking, right? I'm always thinking bigger picture. If you're truly thinking about, what do you do next year? Who do you bring in next year in that situation instead of right now? That's such a hypothetical, Lindsay, that you're asking. And it's a great question. I'm sorry that I bowed out without a whole bunch of courage.
No, I get it. You gotta be careful in some of these ways. I guess my point is that I think where Sean put him in the bottom half is easy. I think I might go like 25th. Like he's just not playing well. And at this point in time too, you have to be thinking about organization and just leadership and culture and environment. And I think that there's a lot that he brings to the table at this point in time outside of just his ability to drop back, find the open man, get him the ball. Like, I just think that there's a lot that goes along with him that I don't necessarily and I don't know that that's what I want to build around. And I think that might be part of what the Jets are dealing with right now. Let's move on to some other quarterbacks. And the reason that Sean was here, because we wanted to talk about some of these younger quarterbacks that seemed to have put some good play on tape in the last few weeks. Want to involve Bryce Young in this conversation, which is why I say the last few weeks, because he seems to have improved in his last few outings. They were obviously on a bye last week, so we don't have him top of mind in that department. But in terms of last week alone, we've got Anthony Richardson, different AR. And we have Caleb with a new, the offensive coordinator is gone, and the advanced numbers seem to be pointing up. In the case of both of them, Caleb was 7th in EPA on the week at quarterback, 9th in EPA per drop back, 14th in completion percentage over expectation, and 10th in completion percentage. Anthony Richardson also top 12th most passing yards on the week, 8th best EPA of the week, 7th in EPA per drop back, 15th in completion percentage over expectation, ahead of Joe Burrow. That clearly was because the first half was included. Also 18th in completion percentage, 9th in air yards per attempt, 8th in deep ball rate. Like, I'm really curious to hear what you saw when you looked at the tape of both of these guys. Let's start with Caleb specifically, and what was different for the Bears offense.
It felt like they were more comfortable just having quick throws. I thought their offensive line looked a lot cleaner, and Caleb, because of that, he was also comfortable just taking off. I think when he needed to, he was involved in the design run game, but early in the season, you see him sometimes in the pocket, and it looks like he's just a little bit too rigid, where we've seen so much fluidity of him on tape at USC. So I thought that he was more comfortable, more confident. And it's not like he, blew everyone out the water, but I think he did a lot of things in the right direction, where early in the season, we see him have a ton on his plate. He's setting pass protection. He's getting them into checks over and over. And you look at the situation, of course, they're changing it a little bit, and just hopefully you can make things a little bit easier for him, because he is an ultra talented player. And I was really happy to see just more positive things on tape from him in that unfortunate loss against the Packers. But I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Anthony Richardson. He's such an easy player to root for, of course, because he is so talented. And I think that we saw him look a lot more comfortable. There's still operational aspects that I think are a little bit of a problem. Like, you can't have fumbles on zone reads and things like that, but you're going to see some splash plays where you can involve him in the run game. He's more accurate on that deep ball. Obviously, you want to see him just continue to raise that floor a little bit, where you making those short passes kind of consistently. It's just so hard for me to give up on a guy like Anthony Richardson.
Two questions on Anthony Richardson. One, we know that he's got the deep ball completion. We know that that's a strong point. It has been, right? His underneath is the lowest. His percentage rate is the lowest. Consistency is questionable. You say he's a guy you want to pull for. Do you really want to pull for a guy that taps out? I want to ask you that. Do you truly? I don't know. Maybe
I think it's an important conversation. I think we've seen players across the league, you improve in different ways. You hope that, like, it really doesn't matter what I think. It matters what those guys in the locker room think. And you hope that Richardson is able to earn that trust. When you see those 2 rushing touchdowns with him running through defenders, you hope that the Colts are able to get on him. And look, I feel comfortable that the veterans in the locker room were like, look, you cannot do that. You cannot do that as a quarterback in the league. And it's on him to earn that trust back. I think the offense does different things. You get into a bunch more play action. You make things a little bit easier on him. And it is up to him, to show that maturity. And it feels like in those 2 weeks, it seems like he did, because what he put out, I think, on the field was a positive thing. And you hope that a really just bad moment for Richardson is just a mark kind of on the bottom of a Wikipedia page and something, a long thing of the past where he earns a trust back of his team.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, he was smoking people at the goal line running. We saw what he did. So it's not like a lack of, physical toughness. And I know there have been comments by coaches and players about his maturity over the last couple of weeks. My cynical side is saying that's fine, but we drafted this cat to be the guy. And why is it taking 2 weeks into the second season for him to, gain maturity? Obviously more than 2 weeks. That's my side of like, wait a minute now, but it can turn the corner. Lindsay, I know you have I don't want to say a soft spot for Anthony Richardson, but you do. Yeah. I mean, so I'm just saying Chris Ballard knows football players. He sees the upside being a GM there. Of course, he knows the upside of this guy. And, we've talked about this. It's not always easy to draft off of potential, right? That's a big move. And if it hits, man, it is a massive score. And it will be time will tell, of course.
I think the thing is, though, and my soft spot is that I have like a physical tool. There's no way for this to come out and not sound weird. It's specifically like I have a crush on him as a quarterback in terms of like what he brings to the table that is so hard to find, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's no doubt we've all seen those flashes where the throws that he makes, just physically in terms of strength, off platform, falling back, like just boop, 75 yards. You're just like, that's not something that you can find on the street. And
we also saw that with Jeff George. I'm sorry. I'm talking about arm strength, not the athleticism. Don't get me wrong.
But then there's also the athleticism and the fact that this guy looks like Willie McGinnis running down the field. You know what I mean? Like he's ginormous. And so the physicality with which he can tuck and run and then speed attached, that like the whole package is just so exciting and enticing that I feel more protective of it. I want this developed. He is very young and very inexperienced by quarterback standards in terms of college dropbacks compared to the other guys around the league. Like Jordan Love, I've said this before, had like something like 1,400 dropbacks or something in college and then got time on the bench to learn and develop without anyone watching. He learned how to be a professional. He learned how to watch tape. He learned how to go through reads. He learned the speed at which he was going to be going up against these people. Anthony Richardson hasn't done that. He had like 400 dropbacks in college. He's 22 years old. He's still like a college aged guy, like that's a redshirt senior age. And he's been in the league for 2 years. So yes, maybe there's some immaturity there. That kind of goes with the territory. And I put a little bit of that back on the Colts. I want some clarity. I want you to take some responsibility in terms of developing him. And the thing that really frustrated me when they were developing him for those 2 weeks when Joe Flacco was playing is they couldn't articulate a way that they were developing him and what their plan was. And they kept just talking about the process in the most vague way, in a way where I kind of feel like if you really sat down and you thought, how are we going to message this? That there was a way to message it. Like there is a way to have explained that in a way where we felt like you actually had identified some things that he just needed more reps doing without throwing him under the bus and without being super specific. And they just didn't even bother to try, which made me feel like on the outside that they didn't actually have a plan. And I don't have as much faith in them as I did, before in terms of I wanted him to come to the bench to be developed. But then once I saw what they were saying, I was like, oh no, shoot, this might not actually even be happening. I don't know. And which is not to say that it wasn't. I just wish that they'd messaged it differently. So it was clear to the Colts fan base that it was, because when they put him back in last week, that clearly wasn't an indication of whether he looked better or not on the field. That like, oh, there you go. We did it. We saw a lot of good stuff. That had nothing to do with it. Joe Flacco was crappy. Like we have to put him back on because we're not getting anything out of Joe Flacco. Like now the cost benefit is it's not helping us at all. We might as well let him develop on the field.
And those are great points. And I would say to you, Lindsay, respectfully, just on the wording of it, and this is probably me being the particular wordsmith that I try to be in reports when I ask scouts or GMs or AGMs about what they think. I think they have a plan. You said they didn't have a plan. I know
No,
that.
I'm saying it doesn't seem like it. I don't.
The depth of the plan is maybe what I'm saying, Lindsay. Right? I get your point. It's more the depth of, because I believe anytime you take someone, especially a quarterback, that is a sort of it's more of a rare situation. It's not like you have a guy that's played 4 years in college or 3 years in college and everything is set up and you know what he is. We knew what Matt Ryan was and we still had a plan. You have to have a plan. When you're talking about some of these guys that are outrageous athletes and have limited time, the depth of that plan better be very significant in my mind. I would love one day to sit down over a beer with their staff and talk to Chris Ballard and find out, tell me what that was. I would like to learn what that plan was. And I've always said this, is it worth having 5 or 6 handlers at all levels to help someone mature like that? We could go back to some quarterbacks in the past. If that guy's going to take you to the Super Bowl and it's high maintenance in a lot of ways, at least to get him there, is it worth the organization's investment, energy-wise, money-wise? Hell yes, it is. But it better be very, very much well thought out and mapped out, right? So it's not like you're saying something that's a little bit precarious. How deep has it gone? It's a really great point that you make.
I just don't want it to just be like he showed up for work and he showed some, he worked his way back into our good graces. And he was so like, because we're hearing a lot of things out of the building of saying like that are praising his maturity. And that's good. The outside, the public needs to hear that after the tap out, right? You want reason to have faith that he is kind of learning his lesson, but I also would like some clues that is also happening within the organization. I just want to make sure that he is. I would also love to sit down and have that conversation with Steichen and his anyone in Indianapolis about what was really going on during this time frame. Sean, before we let you go, you mentioned play action. His play action rate was up, I think, by quite a bit this past week. And so maybe that is part of the plan. And I think his footwork looked like it had slowed down. He looked a little bit like he was less hurried in the pocket. And so maybe there's some evidence that he will be a better quarterback moving forward. How confident are you? I believe he's got a tough matchup this week. Who's he playing? I feel like I have that on my radar as like we might have to hit pause on our expectations for him. Who are they playing? Sorry, I should know this.
The Colts have the Lions this week, which that's not the matchup that you want. I think you look at it, and obviously the Lions lose Alex Anzalone. You think maybe can the Colts do something in terms of the quarterback run game? You're going to see a ton of man coverage in Detroit. You're hopefully just able to connect on some of those deep throws. I guess, am I going to put all my chips in the table for Anthony Richardson? Maybe not yet. I really like seeing that progression. You're going in that positive direction. It's hard sometimes. Like I look at Drake May just playing like so awesome and playing in a way that I really love. Obviously, Bo Nix able to clean things up, but I think Richardson has a chance to continue to improve, to raise that floor. I mean, you guys talk about the plan. Obviously, you hope that, Steichen has his Jalen Hurts in a way, and you're able to just get more reps. Like this guy has not played a ton of college football or professional football. So it's tough that we make it so hard in the media in that, hey, if you're not winning after 5 games, like things are looking bad. Like, hey, Caleb Williams, you didn't, look like a star right away. Jaden Daniels is having a bunch of success. Now, are you a bust? I think that you have to take a bunch of time. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have, the liberty of a lot of time, but I hope that Richardson, we keep getting snaps of him, keep improving, clean up that footwork, be patient, be calm, connect on those passes. And hey, maybe you give Detroit, a little bit of a scare.
Last question before we let you go. I alluded to Bryce Young, who also has a very tough matchup this week against the Chiefs. All 3 of these guys, by the way, the Bears and Caleb have the Vikings. Like what? All 3 of these defenses, the Lions, the Vikings, and the Chiefs, that's exactly who I would say, like, who could we avoid while we're trying to get a good read on these guys and hope that they continue to take steps in the right direction? What have we seen from Bryce Young that is notable? And does it complicate the decision for the Panthers moving forward in your mind, or not so much, but he's getting better? I don't know what to make of this.
Yeah, I think for Bryce Young, he is a really unique player. He was a really unique player coming into the draft. So to me, you have to create a pretty unique offense around that. I do think against the Giants, they did a good job. Get it empty, spread it out, let Bryce be a point guard over and over. And you see glimpses of the play extension. You see him being more comfortable in the pocket, I think, because he's getting better offensive line play. So I think that can be a positive thing. I'm not sure. It feels like once you make the decision to move on from Bryce Young the first time, it feels like the overall decision is kind of made. I'm interested to see. He can absolutely continue to improve. It feels like maybe that ceiling is just limited, a little bit in terms of, can you access the middle of the field consistently? Do you have to live in such kind of an odd offense over and over again? So I'm excited to see him hopefully continue to improve. And it might be a situation for him as well that it's going to be, you bounce around a little bit. You're able to sit on the bench. You're able to get into a positive situation, and then you're able to get things going again.
Very good. Sean Syed, you can find him twice a week on the Stats and Scheme podcast with Tej Seth. And of course, his work is all over the SumerSports website, where you can also find more of his written work. Sean, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you, Thomas. It's fun as always to get your thoughts on what's going on around the league.
Great job, Sean. And Lindsay, I agree. I mean, man, it's a passionate day, right? We probably will hang up and talk for another 30 minutes about
it. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Everybody who's along with us for the ride. If you're not already a subscriber to the podcast version of the show, which you can go back and listen to at any time if there's anything that you feel like you missed, that is available wherever you get your podcast. Just go ahead and click follow. Give us a 5-star review, please, and leave a written review. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show and what you'd like to hear more of in the future. And in the meantime, we'll see you next Tuesday.